Hey everyone, welcome to another gentle journey through history's quieter corners. Tonight we're slipping away from the clash of swords and the thunder of kingdoms to discover something far more peaceful, yet equally fascinating. We're stepping through the heavy wooden doors of medieval convents to explore the hidden lives of nuns. Those women who chose a path of devotion in a world that rarely gave women any choices at all. So dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. Because behind those stone walls and whispered prayers lies a story of remarkable women who found ways to live, learn, and even thrive in an age that expected them to remain silent and invisible. Picture this. It's the year 1150, and you're walking along a muddy path through the English countryside. The morning mist clings to the fields, and in the distance, you hear the soft chiming of bells, calling the faithful to prayer. But these aren't the deep, resonant bells of a cathedral. These are gentler, more melodic, floating across the landscape from a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by high walls. This is a convent, and within those walls live women whose daily existence was governed by rhythms older than memory itself. The medieval convent was far more than a place where women went to pray. It was a sanctuary, a school, a hospital, a library, and sometimes even a center of political power. For many women, especially those from noble families, the convent offered something extraordinary for its time: independence. Not the kind of independence we understand today, but a freedom from the endless cycle of marriage, childbirth, and submission to male authority that defined most women's lives in medieval Europe. When a young woman entered a convent, she underwent a transformation that went far deeper than simply changing her clothes. The ceremony of taking the veil was elaborate and deeply symbolic. She would lie prostrate on the cold stone floor while prayers were sung over her, symbolically dying to her old life. Her hair would be cut short or shaved entirely, and she would don the simple woolen habit that would become her uniform for the rest of her days. But this wasn't just about giving up worldly pleasures. It was about gaining access to a world that was otherwise completely closed to women. Within the convent walls, nuns could read and write at a time when literacy was rare even among men. They could study theology, philosophy, and natural sciences. They could own property, make important decisions, and exercise authority over others. The abbess, the woman who led the convent, wielded power that rivaled that of bishops and sometimes even challenged kings. She controlled vast estates, commanded the loyalty of hundreds of women, and negotiated directly with the highest authorities of church and state. But let's step away from the grand political stage and look at what daily life was actually like for these remarkable women. The day began long before sunrise, usually around 2 in the morning, with the first prayer service called matins. Can you imagine stumbling out of a narrow, cold bed in the middle of the night, wrapping a rough woolen cloak around your shoulders, and making your way through dark corridors lit only by flickering candles to join your sisters in the chapel? The chapel itself would have been a marvel of medieval architecture, with soaring stone arches and windows that caught and scattered the early morning light in jeweled patterns across the floor. But at 2 in the morning, it was a cavern of shadows and whispered prayers, where dozens of women gathered to begin their day with ancient hymns that had been sung in the same way for centuries. After matins came lauds at dawn, then prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and finally compline before bed. 7 prayer services that divided the day into sacred segments, creating a rhythm that was both demanding and oddly comforting. Between these services, the nuns engaged in what they called the work of their hands. This wasn't busy work or simple craft projects. This was skilled labor that often supported entire communities. Many convents were renowned for their textile work. Nuns produced some of the finest embroidery in medieval Europe, creating vestments and altar cloths that that were treasured in cathedrals across the continent. They developed techniques for weaving and dyeing that were trade secrets passed down through generations. Some convents specialized in copying manuscripts, their scriptoriums filled with nuns bent over vellum pages, carefully reproducing classical texts, biblical commentaries, and even secular literature with an attention to detail that modern printing can barely match. The work of copying manuscripts was particularly significant because it meant that nuns were not just preserving knowledge, they were actively engaging with it. To copy a text accurately, you had to understand it. Many nuns became scholars in their own right, writing commentaries on the works they copied, and even creating original texts. Some of the most important theological and philosophical works of the medieval period came from the pens of nuns, whose names have been largely forgotten by history. But scholarly work was just one aspect of convent life. Many convents also served as hospitals and centers of medical learning. Nuns developed extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, surgery, and patient care. They tended not only to their own communities, but often to the surrounding population as well. In an age when medical knowledge was primitive and doctors were scarce, the convent infirmary was often the only place where the sick could receive competent care. The herb gardens of medieval convents were marvels of botanical knowledge. Nuns cultivated hundreds of different plants, each with specific medicinal properties. They understood which herbs could reduce fever, which could aid digestion, which could ease pain, and which could help with childbirth. This knowledge was carefully recorded in herbal texts that were passed down through generations of nuns, creating a medical tradition that was often more effective than the treatments offered by university-trained physicians. Education was another crucial function of many convents. While formal schools for girls were virtually non-existent in medieval Europe, convents often accepted young girls as students, teaching them to read and write, instructing them in mathematics and natural philosophy, and providing them with skills that would serve them whether they chose to remain in religious life or return to the secular world. The daily schedule of a medieval convent was structured around the divine office, but it also accommodated a remarkable variety of activities. After the morning prayers and a simple breakfast of bread and weak ale, nuns might spend their morning hours in the scriptorium copying manuscripts, in the infirmary tending to the sick, in the kitchen preparing meals for the community, or in the workshops creating textiles or other goods that the convent could sell to support itself. The afternoon often brought time for personal study and reflection. Many nuns used this time to deepen their understanding of theology, to practice their writing skills, or to work on personal projects. Some wrote letters to friends and family members outside the convent. Others composed prayers, hymns, or even secular poetry. This was a time when the individual personality could emerge from beneath the collective identity of religious life. The evening meal was usually the main meal of the day, though it was simple by modern standards. Bread, vegetables from the convent garden, perhaps some fish or eggs, and water or weak ale. The meal was eaten in silence while one of the nuns read aloud from a religious text, but this silence wasn't oppressive. It was contemplative, allowing each woman to reflect on the words being read and to prepare spiritually for the evening prayers that would conclude the day. After Compline, the final prayer service of the day, the convent entered what was called the Great Silence. From evening until morning, no unnecessary words were spoken. This wasn't just a rule about noise. It was a recognition that silence itself could be a form of prayer, a way of creating space for deeper contemplation and spiritual growth. The sleeping arrangements in most convents reflected both the communal nature of religious life and the practical constraints of medieval architecture. Nuns typically slept in long dormitories, lined with simple beds, each with a straw mattress, a woolen blanket, and perhaps a small wooden chest for personal belongings. Privacy was minimal, but this too served a spiritual purpose, reminding the nuns that they had chosen to live not for themselves alone, but as part of a larger community dedicated to serving God and neighbour. Yet within this seemingly restrictive environment, many nuns found extraordinary freedom to express their creativity and intellect. Some of the most beautiful and intricate artwork of the medieval period emerged from convent workshops. Illuminated manuscripts created by nuns featured delicate marginalia that revealed not just artistic skill, but also a sense of humour and playful creativity that might surprise modern observers. Hidden among the solemn religious texts were tiny drawings of rabbits playing musical instruments, cats chasing mice through biblical scenes, and elaborate floral borders that seemed to dance across the page. The scriptorium was often the intellectual heart of the convent, a place where knowledge flowed as freely as ink from quill pens. Here, nuns engaged with texts that ranged far beyond religious doctrine. They copied works of classical philosophy, medical treatises, historical chronicles, and even romantic literature. In the process, they became some of the most educated people of their time, male or female. Many developed such expertise in their chosen fields that they corresponded with scholars across Europe, their letters travelling along the same trade routes that carried spices and silk. Some convents developed reputations for specific types of learning. The nuns of Gandersheim in Germany became renowned for their theatrical productions, writing and performing plays that brought classical stories to life within the convent walls. Other communities specialized in music, developing complex polyphonic compositions that pushed the boundaries of medieval musical theory. Still others focused on natural philosophy, conducting experiments in alchemy and astronomy that contributed to the gradual expansion of human knowledge. The economic independence of many convents was remarkable for its time. While technically under the authority of male church officials, many abbesses managed vast financial empires with skill that would have impressed any merchant prince. They negotiated trade agreements, invested in land and livestock, and sometimes even engaged in what we might today call international commerce. The wool produced by convent flocks might end up woven into cloth in Flanders, while the medicinal herbs grown in convent gardens could be found in apothecary shops from London to Constantinople. This economic power translated into real influence in the wider world. When political crises erupted, kings and nobles often sought the counsel of abbesses, whose wisdom and neutrality made them valuable mediators. Some abbesses wielded ecclesiastical authority that was virtually episcopal, confirming priests in their positions and making decisions about church doctrine within their territories. They hosted diplomatic meetings, provided sanctuary for political refugees, and occasionally even raised armies to defend their lands and people. The relationship between individual nuns and their families often remained strong throughout their religious careers. Far from being cut off from the world, many nuns maintained extensive correspondence with relatives, friends, and associates outside the convent walls. They provided advice on family matters, helped arrange marriages for nieces and nephews, and sometimes played crucial roles in preserving family wealth and status through difficult political transitions. For women from noble families, entering a convent didn't necessarily mean abandoning worldly concerns entirely. Many brought with them substantial dowries that became part of the convent's endowment. But they also brought networks of social and political connections that could benefit their new community. An abbess with royal blood in her veins might find herself entertaining queens and princesses, hosting elaborate feasts that rivaled those of any secular court. The daily rhythm of prayer and work created a unique environment where contemplation and action were seamlessly integrated. A nun might spend her morning deep in theological study, her afternoon tending to sick villagers in the convent infirmary, and her evening creating exquisite embroidery for a cathedral altar. This integration of spiritual and practical concerns produced women of extraordinary capability and depth. The winter months brought their own particular challenges and rhythms to convent life. With shorter days and longer nights, more time was spent by candlelight in the scriptorium or gathered around braziers in the common rooms, sharing stories and working on communal projects. The herb gardens lay dormant under blankets of snow, but the stores of dried medicines and preserved foods testified to the careful planning that sustained the community through the lean months. Spring brought renewal not just to the natural world, but to the spiritual life of the community as well. Gardens were replanted with both practical crops and decorative flowers that would grace the altar throughout the growing season. Young women who had spent the winter months as postulants might take their first vows, their white veils replaced with the black habits of full nuns in ceremonies that marked their complete integration into the community. The libraries of major convents were treasures beyond measure, containing not only religious texts but also works of history, literature, philosophy and science that might be found nowhere else. Some nuns became accomplished librarians, developing cataloguing systems that helped preserve and organize knowledge for future generations. They understood that they were not just custodians of books, but guardians of civilization itself, protecting humanity's intellectual heritage through periods of war, plague, and social upheaval. Medical knowledge flourished particularly in convent communities, where the combination of scholarly learning and practical necessity created ideal conditions for advancing the healing arts. Nuns developed surgical techniques, created new pharmaceutical preparations, and established hospitals that served not just their own communities, but entire regions. Some became so renowned for their medical skills that patients traveled hundreds of miles to seek their treatment. The evening hours after Compline, when the great silence descended over the convent, were often times of profound personal reflection and spiritual growth. In the quiet darkness of their dormitories, nuns contemplated the day's experiences, examined their consciences, and deepened their relationship with the divine. This silence wasn't empty, but full, pregnant with possibilities for insight and transformation that could only emerge in the absence of constant external stimulation. The changing seasons marked not just the passage of time, but the evolution of each nun's spiritual journey. As years turned into decades within the convent walls, women who had entered as uncertain young girls transformed into figures of quiet authority and deep wisdom. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible, like the slow weathering of stone that eventually creates the most beautiful cathedral facades. Many nuns developed specializations that went far beyond their original expectations. A woman who had entered the convent, expecting to spend her days in simple prayer, might discover an aptitude for complex theological debate that earned her correspondence with bishops across Europe. Another might find that her gentle touch with the sick led to innovations in surgical technique that saved countless lives. The convent environment, with its emphasis on both contemplation and practical service, seemed to draw out hidden talents that might never have emerged in the restrictive world outside. The relationship between different convents created networks of knowledge and support that spanned continents. When a new medicinal technique was discovered in a German abbey, the information would travel through chains of correspondence to reach sisters in Ireland, Spain, and the far reaches of Eastern Europe. These women created what was essentially the world's first international network of female scholars, sharing discoveries and insights across linguistic and political boundaries that would have been impossible for secular women to cross. The political influence of some abbesses rivaled that of any lord or bishop. When disputes arose between kingdoms, when succession crises threatened to tear apart royal families, when trade disagreements escalated into potential wars, the neutral ground of a powerful convent often provided the perfect venue for delicate negotiations. Abbesses developed reputations as shrewd diplomats whose word was trusted by all parties, precisely because their ultimate loyalty lay not with any earthly power, but with principles that transcended political concerns. Within the convent walls, democracy existed in forms that wouldn't be seen in the secular world for centuries. Major decisions were often made collectively, with each nun having a voice in deliberations that affected the entire community. The process of electing a new abbess involved careful consideration of each candidate's qualifications, with debates that could stretch over weeks as the community sought to discern which sister would best serve their collective needs. The daily office of prayers created a rhythm that synchronized not just individual days, but entire lifetimes. A woman who entered the convent at 15 would, by her 60th year, have participated in over 100,000 prayer services. This repetition created a kind of spiritual muscle memory that shaped not just behavior, but thought patterns themselves. The ancient words of psalms and hymns became so deeply embedded in consciousness that they colored every experience, providing a constant backdrop of meaning and connection to something greater than individual concerns. The creative output of medieval convents was staggering in both quantity and quality. Some nuns became accomplished composers, creating musical settings for liturgical texts that are still performed today. Others developed new techniques in manuscript illumination that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with quill, ink, and gold leaf. The combination of technical skill, unlimited time for practice, and deep spiritual motivation produced artwork that combined beauty with profound meaning in ways that purely secular artists rarely achieved. The educational role of convents extended far beyond formal instruction. Young girls who came to the convent for schooling absorbed not just reading and writing skills, but entire worldviews that emphasized learning, service, and the possibility of female authority. Many of these girls would eventually leave to marry and raise families, carrying with them examples of what women could accomplish when given proper opportunities and support. Food preparation in the convent was elevated to an art form that combined practical nutrition with spiritual symbolism. The sister who served as head cook often possessed knowledge of herbs and spices that rivaled any professional chef, but her creations were designed not just to nourish the body, but to support the contemplative life. Meals were carefully planned to provide energy for long hours of prayer and work, while avoiding foods that might stimulate worldly desires or disrupt the peaceful atmosphere of the community. The convent's relationship with the surrounding community was complex and multifaceted. While the nuns lived apart from the world in many ways, their services were essential to the health and welfare of entire regions. During times of plague or famine, convent gates would open to provide sanctuary and aid to desperate refugees. The medicines prepared in convent laboratories were often the only effective treatments available for hundreds of miles around. The psychological benefits of convent life, while rarely discussed in medieval sources, become apparent when we consider the testimonies that do survive. Women wrote of finding peace after lives of constant anxiety, of discovering intellectual capabilities they never knew they possessed, of forming friendships deeper than any they had experienced in the competitive world of noble courts. The convent offered something that was almost impossible to find elsewhere in medieval society, a place where a woman's worth was measured not by her beauty, her fertility, or her family connections, but by her character, intelligence, and service to others. The seasonal cycles that governed agricultural work also shaped the spiritual life of the convent in subtle ways. Spring planting was accompanied by prayers for new growth, not just in the fields, but in the souls of the community. Summer harvests were times of gratitude and celebration, when the fruits of both earthly and spiritual labor could be gathered and appreciated. Autumn brought reflection on mortality and the need to prepare for lean times ahead, while winter offered opportunities for deeper contemplation and study when outdoor work was impossible. Some convents developed reputations as centers of mystical experience, attracting women who sought direct communion with the divine through prayer, fasting, and contemplation. These communities produced some of the most profound spiritual writings of the medieval period, texts that explored the depths of human consciousness and the possibilities of transcendent experience with a sophistication that matched anything produced by male theologians. The practical skills required for convent self-sufficiency created women of remarkable versatility. A single nun might serve as accountant, pharmacist, teacher, nurse, diplomat, and spiritual counselor, switching between roles as community needs demanded. This of experience Bray produced individuals of extraordinary capability, who could adapt to almost any challenge or opportunity that arose. The evening hours, when individual study was permitted, became times of intense intellectual activity. Nuns pored over theological texts, composed letters to scholars across Europe, worked on translations between Latin and vernacular languages, and pursued original research in fields ranging from astronomy to botany. The quiet scratching of quill pens and the soft rustle of turning pages created a symphony of learning that filled the night air with the sound of minds at work. The bonds formed between nuns often lasted entire lifetimes, creating a sisterhood that went far beyond mere institutional affiliation. Women who had shared decades of prayer, work, joy, and sorrow developed relationships of extraordinary depth and mutual support. When one sister fell ill, others would take on her duties without complaint. When a nun achieved some scholarly recognition, the entire community celebrated her success as their own. Death in the convent was handled with a dignity and care that reflected the community's understanding of mortality as a natural transition rather than a defeat. Dying nuns were surrounded by their sisters, who prayed with them, read to them from favorite texts, and ensured that their final moments were filled with the love and support that had characterized their years of service. The knowledge that one would not face death alone was perhaps one of the greatest comforts that convent life offered. The legacy of these medieval nuns extends far beyond their own historical period. They preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, advanced medical knowledge, created artistic masterpieces, and demonstrated that women were capable of intellectual and spiritual achievements equal to any man's. Their quiet revolution within the walls of their convents laid groundwork for changes in society's understanding of women's capabilities that would eventually transform the entire world. As night deepened around the medieval convent, and the last prayers of Compline faded into silence, these remarkable women would make their way to their simple beds, knowing that they had spent another day in service to something greater than themselves. Tomorrow would bring the same rhythm of prayer and work, the same opportunities for learning and service, the same chance to grow in wisdom and grace. In a world that offered women few choices, they had chosen the path that led to the fullest expression of their human potential. The scriptorium held a particular magic in the quiet hours before dawn, when the first pale light began to filter through the narrow windows and illuminate the rows of desks where patient hands had labored over countless manuscripts. In this sacred workspace, nuns became the silent guardians of knowledge itself, their careful copying preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost forever to the chaos of war or the ravages of time. Each manuscript was a work of art as much as preservation. The initial letters of chapters bloomed across the page in brilliant blues and golds, their intricate designs often incorporating local flora or whimsical creatures that revealed the personality behind the formal religious text. A sister skilled in illumination might spend weeks perfecting a single decorate moving with thread capital. Her brush precision of a surgeon as she added layer upon layer of pigment mixed from crushed gems and exotic minerals. The relationship between the convent and the natural world was deeply intimate. The walls that separated the nuns from secular society were permeable to the rhythms of earth and sky. Gardens served not just practical purposes, but spiritual ones, their carefully tended beds reflecting the ordered beauty that the sisters sought to cultivate in their own souls. The abbey's orchards provided fruit for both table and medicine, while the beehives hummed with activity that seemed to echo the constant prayers rising from the chapel. Winter brought a different kind of intimacy to convent life. As snow covered the gardens and ice glazed the windows, the community drew closer together around braziers and shared tasks. This was the season for major copying projects, when manuscripts too delicate for summer handling could be safely worked upon in the cool, dry air. The long nights were filled with storytelling, when older nuns would share memories of their early days in religious life, or recount the histories of their communities to younger sisters. And so, as the bells of Compline fade into the gentle darkness of another medieval night, we've walked alongside these extraordinary women who found freedom within walls, knowledge within silence, and purpose within prayer. From the early morning mist of matins to the scholarly pursuits of the scriptorium, from healing herbs to illuminated manuscripts, these nuns carved out lives of remarkable depth and influence in an age that rarely allowed women such opportunities. Their legacy lives on in every preserved text, every medical advancement they pioneered, and every quiet revolution they sparked simply by refusing to remain invisible. Sweet dreams, everyone.